Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 5, in which Johanna and I discuss the Volur and other human women who performed magic. I'm K.S. Barton. I'm the author of the Norse Family Trilogy, a story in which a young Viking woman, the daughter of a Jarl and a Viking warrior, are caught in a deadly blood feud between two families. It's a story of family, love, sacrifice, and betrayal. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Good morning, Kim. How are you?
I am great.
Good. Well, I'm Johanna Wittenberg, and I'm the author of the Norse Women series. It's based on the life of a real Norse queen who ruled alone for 18 years at the dawn of the Viking Age. And I'm currently working on book 6 of the series. Hopefully will be published early next year, early in 2024.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
All right. So this month, we are discussing these real human women who were sorceresses, seeresses, Volur, these women who performed magic.
And they were taken very seriously in the Norse world, and not just in Scandinavia, but all over. There's reports of them going way back to, the Roman times. We're talking about the Volur, and they were vulvas. They were seers. They were powerful, wise women and practitioners of Seeresses, which we talked about a little bit last time. It's a magical trance in which the seer could predict the future and bless people and crops. They could curse, they could cure, and they also seem to have many links to Freya, the goddess Freya. The Volur were itinerant seers who traveled in groups to the steadings where they were made welcome and they prophesied. Usually the groups were 9, but in Arrow Odd Saga, the Volva arrives with a retinue of 15 boys and 15 girls. Then when we get to Eric the Red Saga, that sorceress is the last of 9 sisters. So she's the last one, and they did travel in a group of 9. The retinues were mentioned in several other sagas, including Olaf's saga, Tryggvason, Norna Jest's tale, and others. The assistants were there to summon the spirits with songs called the Vardloker. So the Vardloker was either a song or a chant, and they were used to call the spirits to protect the sorceress when she was in her trance and to guide her.
Do you know, was she in the middle of that circle or was she a part of that circle?
No, she was in the middle.
She was right in the middle.
Yeah, because they were actually, they worked from these platforms, these raised platforms, and they were the only ones on the platforms. And the platforms were called Seithyalas, which means trance platform. And they were always raised up. We don't really know how high. We know they climbed up on them. They never mentioned ladders or anything like that. So we don't really know how high they are, but they were like some kind of a stage, really.
Like a dais, like a high seat or something would sit on.
And they usually had their chair up there, but not always. They had a chair of prophecy, and we'll go into that a little bit more in the next session, because there were grave findings of chairs, little chair charms that may have been the sorceresses, a symbol of the sorceress's chair. But I won't go into that too much this time. The Volva always carried a staff. The name Volva means wand bearer or staff bearers. And many of these staffs are iron, and they look like a distaff, which was used for spinning and weaving. And spinning and weaving were associated with magic. And also the Norn, they were weaving and spinning and cutting men's lives short. But in the old days, the archaeologists called them roasting spits. Because they were almost always found in women's burials, and where there were other cooking implements or things that are identified as female grave goods. But many of these grave findings bear very marked resemblances to the vulva staffs described in the sagas, especially the one that you're going to talk about in a little bit, the Eric the Red saga, but also the Laxdala saga. There's a story about Gudrid, the far traveler who we've heard of before, and she when she became an old woman, she was a very devout Christian, and she was always in the church praying. Her granddaughter had a dream that a woman came to her and complained about her grandmother's prayers and said they disturbed her, and the grandmother's tears were burning her. So they tore up the floorboards of the church, and they found a woman buried under there, and they identified her as a vulva because of her staff. She was buried with her staff. So there's over 50 burials recorded throughout Scandinavia that contain staffs which may likely be magical implements. The majority of them are found in Norway, especially in the fjord district on the west coast. But also the next largest concentration of finds are in Sweden, in the Lake Mälaren district, where the island of Birka is found. And many of the staffs are actually found in the Birka burials. They're usually about 1 meter in length, and although oftentimes we don't get the whole thing, but there aren't usually much longer than that. So they weren't used for walking. They weren't used as a walking stick. And there are a few wooden ones, but very few. And it's thought that maybe there were more wooden ones, but they've rotted away. We don't know. Other names for the Volur were Seithkona, or Saith woman, and Spakona, which means prophecy woman. And these titles are used interchangeably for the same women. In fact, in Norna Guest's tale, they say, at that time there was Spakoner who used to travel the land, and they were called Volur. So those names were interchangeable, and I think it might be that they had different things that they could perform. Men could practice Seither, but it was considered very unmanly and shameful, with some kind of obscure sexual connotations that we don't really know about. I mean, there's lots of speculation. I won't go into it, but because there's no foundation for it. We just know that it was considered possibly unmanly. Freya taught the art of Seither to Odin, and in the Lokasena, Loki gives Odin a hard time about that. So
that makes me think of that little figurine, that little teeny tiny figurine they found in Denmark not too long ago that looks like Odin, like he's sitting on a throne and it looks like there's ravens next to it and it kind of looks like Odin, and yet the figurine is wearing a dress.
Yes, and he's also got his what they think are his wolves.
Right. So it looks like Odin, but he's wearing a dress, which I think is super fascinating.
Yes. And that's one of the things that has kind of led them to think that maybe there's some trance practitioners, and there's some grave findings that we'll talk about in the next episode that kind of bear that out, or suggest it at least. So the sorceresses could take another form. They actually, would cast their mind into a familiar or another animal. And there's one in Cormac's saga where a sorceress takes the form of a walrus and attacks the hero's ship, and the crew manages to drown the walrus, and miles away the sorceress dies in her bed. That's kind of one of their rules of magic, is that you can cast yourself into an animal, but if something bad happens to that animal, it happens to you too.
There's a lot of fantasy stories that use that as well. Yeah.
Yep.
Took it right from the sagas.
It's funny how many of those things, date back to that time, like werewolves and The Walking Dead. Those are all really old ideas. But the best description we have of the Volur are in Eric the Red's saga. And Kim, you can tell us all about that.
Yes. So the saga of Eric the Red it's an Icelandic saga and was written down somewhere in the 1200s. And it concerns the Viking settlement on Greenland. They have some stories and some parts of it that take place in Iceland, but it's anything that takes place on Iceland is usually about how they were run out of Iceland and ended up in Greenland. So, I mean, you've got to be acting badly when you first are kicked out of Norway, then you've got to flee Iceland. You end up all the way up in Greenland. So anyway, so in the saga of Eric the Red, we have the story of a vulva named Thorbjorg. And Johanna and I were talking about this before we were recording, about how many people, men and women in the Icelandic sagas, are named, have some kind of Thor-based name. And it's true. Thorkel, Thorfinn, Thorbjorg, Thora, the list, Thorstein, the list goes on. They were very fond of Thor, apparently, in Iceland. So in the winter, Thorbjorg, the Volva, did a circuit of the settlements, and different people would invite her to their houses or their farmsteads, or, if they wanted to know what their fate was. And so in the saga, one chieftain invited her to his settlement because he wanted to know about the hard times that they were experiencing. There was a drought, there was a famine. It was bad. And he wanted to know when this would end. This was pretty common. The people, especially chieftains, would invite a Volva to the settlement to predict what was going to happen in the future. And then it would become almost like I wouldn't say a festival, but it'd be a gathering of people. So people from all over the region and the districts would come because they just wanted to take part in it. They wanted to maybe have her tell their future, even though, I would never do that, but I don't want to know my future. So, and she was treated very respectfully. She had a lot of specific things that they would do for her. So as Johanna said, they had set up a platform with her. Oh, and the chieftain's name was Thorkel.
Of course.
So he set up a platform with a chair for her, a high seat, and she had a cushion stuffed with feathers. And Thorbjorg was wearing, the way it's translated, some people translate the word as black and some as blue, like a really dark blue. So she had either a black or a blue cloak. I would like to picture it as blue, because that's a much, dramatic, richer.
When it always reminded me of when I read about it, it reminded me of the night sky because it was set with jewels. So those are like stars.
Right. That's right. It was tied at the neck with a string, and then, it had precious stones all the way down to the hem. So it must have just been a magnificent cloak.
And it must have weighed a ton.
It's true. She also wore a string of glass beads around her neck, and on her head, she had a hood of black lamb skin lined with white cat skin.
Very dramatic.
I know. I wish we knew what her hair looked like.
It sounds like she was pretty old because she was the last of 9 sisters, I believe. So she was the last of her kind.
I wonder if she was able to wear it loose, or if she had it braided, if it was braided in like some kind of really ritualistic or, ornamental way.
Good question.
I wish we had evidence of that, but we don't. She was carrying a staff in her hand, and it had a little knob at the top. A lot of them had those knobs at the top, and it was decorated with brass set with stones all the way up to the knob. So not only was her cloak decorated with precious stones, also her staff. So she just must have been magnificent.
She probably sparkled.
She probably sparkled, yes. She wore a belt with a large purse where she kept her charms that she needed. And we'll find out in our next episode when we talk about archaeology, they found a woman in a burial grave she had a little pouch that had a bunch of kind of magical type things in it, like the bones of small animals and henbane, I think. So there were owl pellets, I think. Oh, right. Yes, that too. Yes. So they don't say what her charms were, but she had this pouch with charms. And on her feet, she wore calfskin boots lined with fur, with black shoestrings and large metal knobs on the ends of her shoestrings. And then on her hands, she wore white catskin gloves lined with fur. So she was just
decked out to the nines.
Dazzling, yes. And I can imagine, some of these poor Icelandic farmers, maybe coming around and seeing this woman in that cloak and the fur-lined hood and the fur-lined boots and the fur-lined gloves she just must have been something.
Quite grandiose.
Yes. And I think that, the fact that she had cat skin could be her connection to Freya.
Yes.
Freya's connection with cats and her chariot that was drawn by cats. So that could be some connection. And then when Thorbjorg entered the hall, everybody met her with respectful greetings. So this was no like witch. This was a woman who earned a lot of respect in the community. So not only was her dress ceremonial, even her food was ceremonial. So she had specific requests. She ate porridge with milk from a young goat, and then the meat Thorkel gave her was the hearts of the animals that they had on the farm. So I don't know, that doesn't say if they sacrificed them beforehand in some kind of ritual way. I'm assuming they probably did because they did that quite often. And then she had the hearts. So it's not super specific about how they did that, but I'm assuming it was some kind of a sacrifice.
It must have been.
Yeah. She had a brass spoon and a knife with an ivory handle with brass bands on both ends, and the point of the knife had been broken off. And I don't know if it was an accident or if there was some significance to the tip of the knife being broken.
Nobody knows, but boy, they sure do make sure to point that out. No pun intended. But they do mention it. I mean, they make a specific mention. So yeah, I mean, and of course, a lot of these things they knew what they meant back then. We don't know.
Right. Yeah, I've always wondered, because we don't, this is the most detailed thing we have. And even still, there are a lot of things missing. It would be like, imagine what it would be like to go to a wedding now, and explaining it to somebody else. But if you're explaining it to the wedding you went to somebody else, you wouldn't explain specifically what was happening or why these particular things happen. You'd be like, oh yeah, the bride, she had a beautiful dress. It was, it was a princess cut and it had lace and, or something, but you wouldn't be like, oh, and the reason she walks down the aisle is because of this. And the reason she's wearing a veil is an old tradition because of this. If you're talking to somebody else, you're not going to explain all those things. You're just going to assume your audience knows. And I think that's the way these are written too. They assume the audience knows what they're talking about.
Yeah.
They just weren't thinking about us 1,000 years later. So once she's all situated, the chieftain Thorkel asked her for a prophecy, but she refused to do it until she'd spent the night at the farmstead. I suppose she wanted to get the lay of the land. So the next night, they provided her with what she needed for her enchantments. And once again, they don't give us specifics of what those are. But she was still in need of a woman to help her sing the Vardeloker, which Johanna had mentioned. So she asked around, and there was one woman, Gudrid, who spoke up and said she knew it. She had been taught that song, but she didn't want to sing it because she was a Christian. So there was some goading and convincing, and she finally agreed to do it. I'd love to know what they said to her to get her to change her mind.
Well, and so there again, you realize that Thorbjorg was the last of her kind because she doesn't even have a retinue. She doesn't have anyone traveling with her. She's alone. And the sorceresses used to travel with a large retinue, as we've heard in the sagas. So you can see that Christianity is taking over, and this is the end of the sorceresses' magic.
Oh, yeah. I hadn't thought about it in that light. That makes it a bit tragic.
It does.
Yeah, that's kind of sad. Yeah, so they finally convinced Gudrid to sing the song. So the women who were in attendance, they formed a circle, as we talked about before, around the platform, and then Thorbjorg sat in her hide seat, and then Gudrid sang the song beautifully. They were specific that she'd sang it very well. So Thorbjorg thanked her, said that many spirits had visited them, and then she told them what she'd seen, that the dearth would not last much longer, which I'm sure they were all very happy to hear. So she gave some other prophecies about the affected area, and then she allowed for people to come up to her individually, and she would give them their prophecies, and all her prophecies came true.
And she prophesied for Gudrid, who became a woman we know today as Gudrid the Far Traveler. And she told her that she would travel to many lands.
Gudrid has such a fascinating story. We need to talk about her at some point.
We will, for sure. One thing I was thinking too is that I think that maybe the reason she wanted to spend the night on the farm before she prophesied was to make contact with the landvetter, the land spirits.
Sure.
Because they really believed that these land spirits lived there on the farms. And if you moved something or cut down a tree or moved a rock or destroyed something, they might come to you in a dream and saying, "You're tearing down my house. Please don't do that. You're killing my children." So there's many stories in the sagas about the landvetter coming to the farmer and saying, "No, don't do that. You're hurting my family."
Oh, yeah. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I bet you're absolutely right. Well, don't they still do that in Iceland?
I think so.
Don't they check for elves or something like
Yep.
that?
And Ireland too.
Oh, okay. Even in that movie Eurovision, it's a goofy Will Ferrell movie, and
I never saw that.
The beginning takes place in Iceland. They're Icelanders, and he goes and there's some kind of a little house for an elf house that he goes and talks to the elf. It's pretty funny. Anyway, that's far off topic. So
well, there's a number of other stories and sagas that talk about vulvas. And in Baldur's Dream, Odin awakens a sorceress in her grave outside the gates of hell to ask her why his son Baldur is having nightmares. We also have the Voluspa, in which Odin awakens a vulva to ask her questions about the future and about Ragnarok. Freya, in the Lay of Hyndla, Freya awakens a sleeping vulva and calls her a Jotun and a sister. So that's interesting, which kind of, the Jotuns are kind of a mysterious group of beings that we can talk about more later, but Freya may have called her a sister because she was a fellow sorceress. But she wants Hyndla to tell Freya's lover, Ottar, who she's turned into a swine, what his lineage is that he might claim his inheritance. And at the end, Hyndla and Freya kind of get in a fight. So Hyndla calls Freya a slut, or literally a female goat in heat. And the two have kind of a wizard's duel. Freya sets Hyndla on fire, but Hyndla has carved runes that poisons the cup of beer Freya has given to Ottar. So she has to give him this drink so that he remembers everything he's heard. But it's been poisoned by Hyndla, and Freya outsmarts her by altering the runes on the cups so that they're benign. Anyway, so it's kind of a wizard's duel.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it speaks to how well these women were respected and how powerful they are, that Odin and Freya, two of the most powerful gods and goddess when it comes to magic, would summon them because they needed more information.
Yeah. Yeah, and the one in Voluspa, she conceived from the beginning of the world to the end.
Yeah, she knew everything.
Yes. Well, there is another saga that you know well about a dead vulva who's awakened.
Yes.
So why don't you tell us about
Oh my gosh.
I didn't even know why I'm trying to pronounce it.
I had this all figured out before we started recording. Svipdag is his name.
That's pretty good. You did a good job. What a name.
I think the reason I love this story so much is because it has so many of the tropes that we find in other like hero stories from mythology. It has tropes that we find in fairy tales. I'll point them out when we get to them. So yeah, it's just there's just something I love about it. And anyway, Svipdagsmal is a poem in which the son of a dead vulva visits his mother to gain wisdom from her in his quest to find his love. And she's in another world. So young Svipdag is our hero of the story. And his father had married another woman after Svipdag's mother died. And this stepmother does not like Svipdag, and she wants to get rid of him. So she curses him that the only woman he can marry is a woman named Mengloth, which her name means sunbright, which I think is quite lovely.
Yes.
So of course, it's nearly impossible to get to Mengloth, and Svipdag's evil stepmother knows that. We come to find out later that she's guarded by a Jotun, and so she's probably not even in the human world. She could be in Jotunheim, or she probably more likely is she's in the underworld. So being a hero having to go to the underworld is a very common trope in mythological stories. A lot of the Greek heroes do it. I'm trying to remember any others, but anyway, it happens in Egyptian mythology. There's, trips in the underworld. Plus, we should all recognize the trope of the evil stepmother.
Yes.
It's a very common one. And it's also a common trope in mythology and also in fairy tales to send the hero on an impossible journey or to give him or her an impossible task. Like Psyche,
Yes,
she was given an impossible task. The Irish mythology hero Cuchulainn, he was given some impossible tasks, and he was even sent to find the female warrior.
Skaha.
Yes, I was going to say Skaha. And she lived in the land of shadows. And so Cuchulainn had to go through all kinds of ordeals and dangerous situations to reach her, including having to get across the plane of ill luck, which I actually love that.
I do too.
Because she kind of set herself aside, so away from things, so made it really difficult to get to her because she wanted only the bravest and the brightest. And of course, since he's the hero, Cuchulainn got to her, and he had a little help from his father, who was a god. So back to Svipdag. After hearing the pronouncement from his stepmother, he goes to his mother at her burial mound, and he wakes her and tells her or reminds her that she told him before she died that if he ever needed her, he should come to her. Well, he needs her now. So his mother, Groa, who is standing at the door of her grave looking out at him, recognizes right away that her only son has been cursed. In episode 4, in which we discussed the supernatural women, Johanna mentioned that Groa is a common name for these wise women, these Volvas and Seeresses.
Yes, it is.
Groa even mentions the Norn Skuld when she's talking to Svipdag, basically saying he must let his fate take its course. She knows that there's no escaping your fate.
And isn't that what in the Last Kingdom, isn't that what Uhtred always says?
Oh, right.
Fate is inexorable.
He does. That's right. In all the books, too.
Mm-hmm.
So Svipdagur asks his mother to put a protective spell on him so he won't die on the road. He even says that he's too young to die, which I found kind of interesting because I can't remember if any other heroes in the Norse sagas are worried that they're going to die too young.
I've never heard that before.
I know. It seems like a very modern thing for a young hero to worry about. It didn't seem like something that they would be concerned. But anyway, Svipdag is concerned he's going to be too young to die. So Groa recites 9 spells over her son. And of course, the number 9 is very important in Norse mythology, as we've seen. The more you read these sagas and stories and poems, it just is everywhere. 999, 9 sisters, and 9 spells. Odin was hanged for 9 nights. It's just everywhere. And her protective spells are very specific, which means that she has the foresight to know exactly what might happen to Svipdag on his journey. It's not just some random, I put this spell to protect my son kind of thing. No, she has 9 specific spells. Like, if this happens on the road, I will protect you from this. Like, if you come across these rivers, then they will drain away toward hell. In one stanza, she says that if he finds himself in fetters, she will chant a loosening charm so that the bindings will burst open and then they will fall at Svipdag's feet. So she clearly knows at some point he's going to be taken captive and bound. And one thing I found interesting was she mentioned 2 rivers he would have to cross, Horn and Ruder. These aren't mentioned anywhere else. So
no,
I've never seen them.
I've
even looked them up again, and I couldn't find anything other than these mentions here. So yeah, they just kind of, I wonder with Gjol, they're part of like the rivers of the underworld, kind of like they have the rivers in Greek mythology in the underworld. That's just the only poem there they happen to be. So after Groa says the 9 spells, protective spells, she sinks back into the earth, and Svipdag goes on his way, fortified by his mother's spells. This is where her story ends, but I just kind of wanted to go over a few things that happen in the rest of the way because I just find them kind of fun. Unfortunately, we don't have, so that kind of came in 3 parts. So there was the part of the poem, which was her giving her spells. And then there was a middle part where he was actually on his journey, which is missing, unfortunately. And then we have the end part where he actually comes to the castle. And here he's met at the door by a Jotun, Fjolsvith, and having like a threshold guardian. That's a very mythological, very fairy tale kind of thing to do. And like any good threshold guardian, Fjolsvith, demands to know why Svipdag is there. And then he tells them that weaklings aren't welcome.
Okay.
So we're clearly in the Norse world. Then there's a lot of verbal back and forth between Fjolsvith and Svipdag. And Svipdag doesn't reveal his name, even though the Jotun tries to get it out of him. And we've seen this before. We talked about it with Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and the dragon Fafnir. After Sigurd gives the fatal blow, they have a long conversation in which the dragon tries to get Sigurd's name out of him.
That's another trope.
Yes, definitely. And I think we still have that trope in modern books and movies and cinema and TV shows, only it's not like it's that trope of like the dying person, especially like the dying parent or a dying mentor, and they say some final last words and there's some kind of conversation between the two. I don't know if we have it quite as much about the guardian demanding, who are you?
Not in most modern day, but you were talking about Tolkien the last time,
right?
And and Bilbo and the dragon. That was, but he drew those things directly from Norse.
Oh yeah, and it wasn't like he was shy about admitting it.
No.
I do think of the Wizard of Oz. Remember when they get to the Emerald City and they have the guy come out of the little peek hole and he asks who they are and what they want, and then he says, "No, you can't come in." He denies their entry. So a few things are revealed that maybe indicate that Mengloth is in the underworld. So the two dogs guard the castle in which she's in. One guards by day and one by night. And dogs are often seen in mythology as guardians of the underworld. We have Garm in Norse mythology, who guards the gate to hell. And then there's Cerberus, the three-headed dog in Greek mythology. And then
maybe one of the same.
Yeah, right. And then Svipdag has to go through a gate. It was made by three sons.
Oh.
I wonder if they were dwarves, because that seems like that would fit with Norse stories. And finally, the castle has a giant tree that casts its limbs over all of the land, and the tree can't be felled by fire or iron, which is exactly how Yggdrasil is described. So I don't know. So the gate, the dogs, and the tree make it sound as if she's in the underworld.
Well, and the underworld is under the roots of Yggdrasil,
right.
So under the third root. So yeah.
And of course, there are 9 women who sit with Mengloth and guard her.
So I wonder if is she dead? Is he bringing her back to life?
Yeah,
anyway, I don't
know. No, there's
kind of a crazy thought.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
So
yeah.
He's cursed to only love a dead woman.
Ooh, I like that twist.
Yeah. Anyway, just popped in my head.
Huh. I mean, she could be in Jotunheim, maybe.
She could. There's a lot of dwellings under the roots of Yggdrasil.
Yeah. I love the idea of him being cursed to only marry a woman who's dead. Oh, I like that.
Which, would make it impossible, except that he does.
Right. Yes. There's your writer's brain working. So finally, Svipdag asks the Jotun if there's any man who's worthy of Mengloth. And of course, the Jotun names Svipdag. He says, oh, there's this one man named Svipdag. What a coincidence. Svipdag reveals, hey, I'm him. And so he's destined to be his Mengloth, his husband. So the Jotun throws open the gate and Svipdag walks in. I don't know. He didn't check his ID or anything. Just walked right in. So in like any good Norse story, Mengloth is no shrinking violet. So as soon as Svipdag walks in, she demands to know what he's doing invading her castle. She threatens to have him hanged and his eyes plucked out by hungry ravens if he's lies to her. So she's kind of amazing. I like her a lot. Of course, he's telling the truth and she believes him and they live happily ever after.
Imagine that.
I don't remember. Was it episode 1 or 2? We were talking about that, how we couldn't think of any Norse sagas or poems or things that had happily ever afters. And here's one.
That one does. Well, I'm glad to hear that.
And so our Volva's protective spells, Groa's protective spells, protected her son and helped him fulfill his destiny.
I think that's a wonderful story. I'm quite happy because there's another one called Rolf's Saga Kraki, and it does not have a happy ending. In fact, it has a very tragic, dark ending, which is a little more common in Norse stories. There's several examples where the vulvas obviously prophesy to please their sponsors, but they don't respond well to coercion. And this is illustrated in one of the early episodes of Rolf's Saga Kraki. Early in the story, a king named Frodi has murdered his brother and seized the throne of Denmark. The dead king's sons have gone into hiding, and their uncle is seeking to murder them so that there's no one who can contest him. And this actually was pretty common in Scandinavia during Viking times and earlier. So the dead king's sons go into hiding, and but the evil king calls an assembly in the royal hall, at which the vulva named Hyde, which is the name of my sorceress, she will prophesy. And so all they have a safe platform, and they call the assembly. The two boys are in the audience. They're closest to the door. Now, I don't know why they showed up. They're supposed to be in hiding, but they did. Their sister is also in the hall, and she recognizes her brothers. I guess they're in disguise. But when Frodi asks the vulva to expose the boys and point them out, their sister throws her a golden ring, and the sorceress captures it, and she decides she's going to end her prophecy. But the king threatens her, and he says he will torture her unless she tells him what he wants to know. Well, this kind of pisses her off. So she does identify the boys. And at the same time, she predicts that they will kill the king, Frodi. And at the same time, she warns the boys to run. So they do escape with their lives. And later, they do come back and kill their uncle. So
wow, she had a lot going on in there.
She sure did. I mean, she's a quick-witted woman. So later in the tale, our hero, Rolf, has a half-sister named Skuld, interestingly enough. And she was born to an elf woman. They have the same father, but her mother is an elf woman. And she grows up to become a very powerful witch queen. And she hates her brother. And she goes to war with him at the end of the saga because she wants his kingdom. And she raises an army of magical creatures, as well as an army of the dead who cannot be killed. So this is a trope that is around for centuries later, including Pirates of the Caribbean.
Oh, right. Yes.
So there's another story called Arrow Odd, and you can tell us about that.
Yeah, Arrow Odd. Arrow Odd is a long story because our hero lives to be 300 years old. And so all kinds of crazy stuff happens. But it's at the beginning, he was rude to a sorceress. So she told him that he would be killed by the horse Faxi. And there's a lot of horses that have that Fax name in them because that means mane.
Right.
Speaking of Tolkien, Shadowfax.
Shadowfax.
So Arrow Odd decided to, maybe thwart his fate, and he killed Faxi and buried him. So after this, Arrow Odd goes off. He lives this very long and a very eventful life. But after a point, he grows homesick and he returns home. So when he's home, I think he's upset about something. I forgot. He trips over Faxi's skull that has somehow worked its way up. A snake slithers out of the skull and bites Arrow Odd. Arrow Odd dies because of the horse. So it's just another story to show that you can't change your fate, no matter what you do.
No matter what you do. As I remember, Arrow Odd was not the most likable guy either, was he?
No. Oh my gosh, no.
So many of the saga heroes are not likable. And that sort of brings us to the least likable one of all, which is Egil and Gunhild, King's mother. Okay, so Gunhild, mother of kings, she was the most famous and probably the most vilified sorceress of all. She was the queen of Eric Bloodaxe, who was the son of Harald Finehair. And Eric ascended to the kingship of all Norway by killing off his many brothers, one by one. But Gunhild's background is somewhat uncertain. In the Harald Fairhair saga by Snorri Sturluson, her father was a jarl in Alogaland, and he sent her north to be trained by two Sami sorcerers. And Snorri tells us she seduced these shamans to give her secret knowledge. And then she arranges for Eric Bloodaxe's men to kill them so she can escape them. But you read a totally different background for her.
Yeah, this one came in the History of Norway, which was written by a monk in the 12th century. This account says that Gunhild was born to Gorm the Old, the king of Denmark, and Queen Thyra. Gunhild and Eric Bloodaxe met at a feast held by King Gorm. And the marriage of Eric and Gunhilda was meant to join the two powerful houses of Norway and Denmark.
Which is perfectly logical as well.
It's perfectly logical. The other one's more fun.
Yes. And the other thing is that sometimes they made up some of these ancestries in order to legitimize later heirs.
True.
Too. So we don't know which is really true.
Right.
But in Egil's saga, Gunhild is painted as an evil witch in her feud with this Egil Skallagrimsson, who, in my opinion, is a raging psychopath from the age of 7. But she's the one who's displayed as she's the one who's vilified as evil, and he's this heroic figure. But on their first meeting, he and his companions were taken in during a storm by the steward of one of Eric and Gunhild's steadings. This steward was named Bard, and he makes them comfortable in their guest house, but he tells them he doesn't have any ale. Well, this isn't really true. It's a little bit of a lie. And when King Eric and Gunhild arrive later that evening, Bard prepares a feast for them, including ale, which I guess he wanted to save for them. He probably didn't have quite enough for everybody. But King Eric, there's people in his guest house, and he insists that they join the festivities, putting Bard in a very uncomfortable position. So Bard brings him in, and he starts to try to make up for his earlier slip, and he starts really forcing the ale on him, being overly generous. Pretty soon, Egil's men are so drunk that they're vomiting all over the place, including inside the hall, which I guess is unforgivable.
Bad form.
Yes. But Bard keeps giving Egil more and more ale so that he gets really drunk too. But according to Egil's saga, Gunhild and Bard tried to poison Egil's ale, but he suspected it, and he carved runes on his cup and smeared the runes with his blood, and then recited a magical verse over the runes, and the cup shattered. Well, this is also something we heard about in the Lay of Hyndla, where Hyndla tries to poison Freya's lover the same way. Anyway, Egil and his son, or his friend, Volur, try to leave the party, but Bard follows them to the door with a horn of ale and insists that Volur drink. We're thinking maybe he was trying to poison him, although that's not explicitly stated. So Egil runs the steward through with his sword and escapes, leaving Volur and all his men passed out. Well, in the morning, Eric sends men to kill Egil, but he eludes them, and he goes on to murder Gunhild's brother and also Gunhild and Eric's 10-year-old son, which I think is just despicable.
I didn't understand how Egil escaped because they were on an island. I know.
Well, there's a whole long story about how he escaped. He escapes by boat and he goes to another island.
Another island.
Yes, and he
But like
hides
they
out
were
there.
they were right on his tail. It was like I think because it's Egil's saga. So
He
maybe he
steals
did
a boat and he gets
yeah,
away.
maybe he performed some magic too. So
Yes, he might very well
he
have.
couldn't be seen.
Well, the upshot is King Eric banished Egil from Norway. And so he goes away for a while, but later he comes back to stay with his son, Bjorn, his friend. I'm sorry, I keep calling him his son. It's his friend, Bjorn. King Eric was willing to tolerate Egil's presence, but Gunhild was not. She sent her 2 brothers to kill Egil and his brother, but they escaped and they left Norway, staying away for many years. And he has lots of adventures during that time. But eventually, Egil returns to Norway to claim his wife's inheritance. But Gunhild speaks against him at the thing. He doesn't get they rule against him. But his behavior is so bad that he makes King Eric furious and he orders Egil's execution. Well, Egil escapes yet again, but before he leaves Norway, he lays a curse on the royal couple. So tell us about this curse.
Yes. So Egil, he kind of like sent his men off. So he was by himself and he stood at the edge of a cliff facing the sea and he had a hazel staff in his hand. So he placed a horse's head on top and he said an invocation, "Here I set up this scorn pole and turn its scorn on Queen Gunhild and King Eric." He then turned the horse's head so that it faced inland and continued, "And I turn its scorn upon the nature spirits that inhabit this land, sending them all astray so that none of them will find its resting place by chance or design until they have driven King Eric and Gunhilda from this land." So he thrusts the pole into the ground, carved the invocation that he just said in runes into the staff. He leaves it there, and then he leaves Norway.
And the land spirits or landvetter, that's something that was very much believed. We talked about this a little bit earlier, that every farm in Iceland and in Norway, they believed in the land spirits, and these land spirits were why your crops were succeeded or failed, why your cow gave milk or didn't give milk. And they actually they had these little elf cups they pour milk into for the land spirits. But anyway, Egil leaves Norway again, and a year later, Eric's half-brother Håkon, who's been raised by the King of England, King Athelstan in England, he invades from England, and he has a far superior force. So Eric and Gunhild have no choice but to flee. Interestingly enough, they flee to Northumbria, and they make a deal with King Athelstan so that Eric becomes the king of Northumbria, and their headquarters are in York. But Gunhild curses Egil so that he could never find peace in Iceland until she has seen him yet again. It so happens that Egil does sail to England, but he intends to avoid Eric's lands, which is Northumbria. However, he's shipwrecked on Eric's shores. This is obviously Gunhild's curse at work. He has to face the music, but his old friend, Bjorn, is there, and he's in good with the king, so he speaks to King Eric on Egil's behalf. So King Eric is not the sharpest knife in the drawer. He is persuaded to forgive Egil in exchange for a praise poem. Egil has one night to compose this poem. He's in his room, his attic room, but a swallow distracts him by twittering outside of his window until his friend Bjorn climbs out on the roof and sits there all night to keep the bird away. It's implied that Gunhild was somehow responsible for this bird. Either she was shape-shifting into the bird or she commanded the bird, controlled its actions. This isn't specifically stated, though, in the saga. It's just implied. Anyway, once the bird is silenced and chased away, Egil succeeds in writing the poem, and in the morning, he reads it to Eric, and in spite of Gunhild's best efforts, he wins the battle and he saves his own life. But he does go back to Iceland. But you know what happened to Gunhild later.
Yeah, so after Eric died, Gunhild takes up with a much younger man named Hrut. He was from Iceland, and they met in Norway, and she lavished him with her favor and even publicly showed her affection for him. So people were not pleased, and not just about the public displays of affection, but the fact that he was so much younger than her. It
So
says
that's
in the
kind
saga
of a double standard.
Totally.
She was just behaving like any king would behave.
Absolutely. Yeah, according to this, it was in Njal's saga. According to the saga, he was a generation younger than her.
Well, how many of these kings, like look at Harold Finehair with his young wives?
Yes. Yeah, all the kings and chieftains, they had young wives. Yeah.
Yes, they did.
So for 2 weeks, Gunhild and Hrut slept in the upper bed, just the two of them. I'm not sure what the upper bed means, but anyway, it was quite scandalous that they were so open about each other. And things were pretty good until then. And then he traveled away. And when he came back, there was something going on, and Gunhild suspected that something was wrong. So he finally decides he's going to go back to Iceland. She asks him, is there a woman? He denies it, but she knows he's going there to get married to somebody. So as he's leaving, she gives him a gift. She gives him a gold bracelet. But along with the gold bracelet, she also curses him. So she curses Hrut that he would find no pleasure in his marriage to the Icelandic woman, Un. He would never have sexual pleasure with his wife, although he could with other women. So it was just specifically with his wife. So Un finally confides in her father, which that must have been a really uncomfortable conversation, that whenever Hrut got near her, he would become his penis would become so enlarged that they couldn't do anything. And
oh, no.
I was thinking, what a specific curse. It's actually a thing, though. I looked it up. It's called, I don't know if it's priapism, priapism, something like that. It's actually a real thing.
Wow.
So anyway, yeah, that was her curse against Hrut. Un and Hrut actually divorced. Her father gave her all kinds of advice about how to actually divorce him. So she did it. And so Gunhild's curse was fulfilled.
Well, I believe that was one of the grounds for divorce in that society.
Yes, it was. Yeah, and a woman could do that. And I think in the story, she does it publicly.
Yes.
They have like they are at some kind of a feast, and there's a lot of people around, and she basically says, I'm divorcing you. And it was okay. She was allowed to do that.
Yeah, it just has to be done in public. And sometimes the grounds are revealed, I believe, in public as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it was an interesting thing that these things needed to be done in public, even killing somebody. As long as you did it in public, it was not murder. It was, there's
or if you went and told somebody about it right after it happened.
Right. That happens in those Icelandic sagas a lot. Yes. Somebody will kill someone and they'll meet some other person along the way, like, oh, by the way, I just killed Thorkel. And then it's like, okay.
It happened a lot, but they killed each other a lot too.
Oh my gosh, they were constantly killing each other.
Yeah.
Over the dumbest things.
Yes.
But poor Gunhilda, that was just not the last of her woes. When she was an old woman, she was betrayed and killed by her own brother, Harold Bluetooth. He lures her to Denmark, and I didn't read why or how he did that. Did you hear anything about how he got her to Denmark?
I didn't read the saga, but I read a really good book called Mother of Kings by Paul Anderson that he wrote way back a long time ago. It's a great book, though. And he explained in that book that she had lost her standing. She was being run out of Norway, or I think she was actually in the Orkneys at that time.
Yeah.
And that Harold Bluetooth offered her shelter.
Okay.
But I didn't actually research the saga itself.
I didn't see anything that in any of the sagas that I looked at.
It's got to be somewhere, though.
Yeah, it's got to be.
But I think it's because, maybe it's kind of like out the deep-minded, her last son had finally died. And so he offered her shelter, possibly as an old woman.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But Harold did her wrong. So he decreed that she should be thrown into a bog and drowned. And a bog drowning was often associated with sorceresses.
It's true.
They even found a woman, what was it? 2012? Maybe I'm mixing it up, but they found a bog woman that they thought maybe was Gunhilda.
Maybe it was her.
But they did some testing and they said it wasn't. She was too old to have.
I remember reading about that. Yeah, I do. And she was a historic figure, and so was Harold Bluetooth. And what's interesting is, he converted to Christianity. So it makes sense that he might have executed her for being a sorceress.
Yeah, it does.
As part of his new Christian beliefs, because
Right.
sorcery was outlawed probably by that time in Denmark. I don't know for sure. That's just a surmise.
It's as a good a reason as any.
It is. Anyway, it's a very sad end for a woman who I think was much maligned.
I agree, because we see time and again in Egil's saga how often he performs magic, and that's not looked down on.
No.
The magic he carves in the runes, he carves in the cup, the horse's head, and there's other instances of him using magic, but that's perfectly fine. But when she uses magic, it's evil.
Well, this was written by misogynistic Christian men. So
yeah. And I also wonder, when you mentioned that when Eric was not the sharpest knife in the drawer, I've also thought that because she was such a strong presence,
she was.
They had to look back and malign her. Like, we can't, she didn't do anything men didn't do. They called her bloodthirsty and stuff because the way she wanted to get Eric on the throne, the way she wanted her sons to be kings. Well, she wasn't doing anything different than any king would have done.
Nope.
But because she was a woman, it was vilified.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because pre-Christianity, women who were that strong that way were actually, honored.
Mm-hmm.
Once it became more traditionally Christian, women lost their status, and any woman who stood up for herself was really considered wrong, bad.
Right. Yeah.
And it was even some of the laws forbade them to do that.
Right.
They lost their right to inherit land. They lost their right to choose their own husband. There were they did retain the right to divorce, but only under certain circumstances.
Right. Yeah, they were pretty specific.
Yes, very
dire. Yeah. And it makes me think, there was a book written, it has to be at least 10 years old, called She-Wolves.
Oh, I haven't read that one.
Oh, it's about English queens. So Eleanor, Queen Maud, Isabella, maybe, I forget. I wish I had it at the top of my head, but it's called She-Wolves. And there was even a YouTube documentary. I think it was a BBC documentary with the author of the book talking about it. It was fascinating that some of these queens, they weren't doing anything different than any king did. That just because they were women, that they were she-wolves. There was something wrong with them.
And that was after the Norman Conquest. Before the Norman Conquest in England, even though they were Christian, women did have full rights, equal rights, or very close to it. And look at Ethelfled, who was, right. I don't want to go into that long story there, but, she did act as a complete autonomous ruler during her husband's illness and after he died.
Right. I highly recommend that book or that documentary if you don't have time.
I'll have to check that out. Yeah, it sounds really great.
So that is our human magical women, who there's a lot of them.
There are.
And there were a lot more smaller instances of sorceresses in a lot of the sagas who were kind of running around, and there might be a paragraph or two about them, but these were some of the most well-known and some of the more important ones.
Yes. So. Yes. And so next time we're going to talk about the archaeology of it. And that is so fascinating because they have uncovered many, many graves, and they bear out much of what's said in the sagas. So it's really quite amazing.
I love the way when the archaeologists find things that substantiate what has been written in the sagas.
Mhm.
Just love it when that happens.
Yeah.
Like the pouch that has the sorceress stuff in it. It's
Yep.
like,
And the staff and
yes, and the
the way
staff.
they're dressed. Oh my gosh, it's yeah.
Yeah.
And we'll also talk about the Oseberg tapestries a little bit because they actually illustrate some of the sorceresses and how they dressed and some of their rituals. You know, we don't completely know what they're doing, but they're definitely portrayed pictorially. And it's one of the few places where there's actually pictures of sorceresses in action. Yeah.
I look forward to that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it was great talking to you again.
Yeah.
All
Very
right.
fun.
We'll see you next time. All
Absolutely.
right. Bye.